Welcome. I'm Eileen Fuchs, the President and Executive Director of the National Building Museum. Thank you so much for joining us for this next program in our timely and important series, Climate ABC. The National Building Museum educates and engages people about the built environment and its impact on our lives and our communities. As a primary driver of global warming, carbon emissions impact everything from the future of coastal cities to the record flooding that threatens communities across the country and around the world. The built environment is responsible for nearly 40% of carbon emissions worldwide, and the museum is committed to offering programs that educate and empower innovative and positive action on this topic. For the last 4 decades, we've presented celebrated exhibitions and programs that have touched on everything from design and construction to social justice and equity issues. And we've been at the forefront of sustainability and resilience topics, beginning with our 2003 exhibition Big and Green towards sustainable architecture in the 21st century, and continuing with our Smart Growth and the For the Greener Good series. And this program is no exception. Climate ABC, which stands for Action Building Community, focuses on 3 essential aspects to addressing climate action. Actions by individuals, businesses, nonprofits, policymakers, and civic entities, examples of buildings, both physical structures and landscapes, and communities at every scale that are working to reduce carbon emissions. These dynamic programs are designed both to educate everyone about climate action and to drive substantive solutions in the building industries to mitigate the worst effects of climate change. We're going to hear shortly, that we have shifted our language and focus about environmental topics from green to climate change since our 2003 exhibition shows just how urgent and critical things have become. We are in good company as we recognize global built environment consulting firm Arup as the 35th recipient of the National Building Museum's Honor Award, acknowledging the firm's extraordinary ability to collaborate with partners and clients to solve today's most pressing problems, including climate change. And we're going to hear shortly how Arup has been leading the way forward in reducing our carbon emissions by focusing on digital technology, nature-based solutions, and community empowerment. This is the first in a series of programs the museum and Arup will co-sponsor over the course of the next several months that will focus on the role the built environment plays in finding solutions for the 3 crises of social justice, climate change, and the resiliency of our ecosystems. I want to thank and recognize Wholesome as the lead sponsor of Climate ABC, and thank Joseph Massett, the VP of Strategy and Commercial Excellence, for his role in providing us with the valuable support we need to undertake this important work. Joseph couldn't be live with us today, but he sends us this taped message, so let's take a quick look now.
The built environment has an essential role to play in our transition to a fully sustainable planet. At the Wholesome family of companies, we're proud to support the National Building Museum's Climate ABC series. Innovation, collaboration, looking at the whole picture. All these are key elements to bring real change, and this series touches on each one of them. Taking meaningful steps to minimize our environmental impact is everyone's responsibility. At Wholesome, we take this seriously and are committed to building a net zero future. We're on our way with our low carbon cements and concretes, our recycled aggregates and asphalt offerings, and our roofing solutions that significantly increase the energy efficiency of any building. But we're just getting started. The opportunities to rethink and transform the built environment are substantial. So let's take up the challenge. Let's do it together, and let's do it right now. On behalf of Wholesome, I want to thank the National Building Museum for the opportunity and Eileen for her leadership.
Great. Thank you, Joseph and Wholesome, for your generous support. And I also want to thank our additional sponsors, EYP, the American Institute of Architects, the American Society of Landscape Architects, and Studios Architecture, as well as C40 Cities, our lead partner. And now it is my pleasure to welcome our moderator. Robert Kay is Arup's America's Climate and Sustainability Services Leader and a principal in the Los Angeles office. Joining the firm in 2022, he brings 32 years of experience in climate change and coastal zone management. Prior to working at Arup, Robert served as the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of ICF's Climate Center, helping clients embrace the climate transition. Throughout his career, Robert has brought people together to solve complex problems. He is a sought-after facilitator and engagement specialist. He specializes in climate issues such as greenhouse gas emissions, sea level rise, adaptation, and sustainable facilities management. Since 2009, Robert has provided expert guidance to Pacific Island delegations to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Please welcome Robert Kay.
Hi, thank you, Eileen. Thank you for those kind words of welcome. So my name is Rob Kay, as Eileen's just said. I'm really looking forward to the discussion ahead. The way that we're going to do this is first I'm going to introduce Fiona Cousins from Arup, who's going to give a short presentation, and then I'll bring in and introduce our panelists. I'll introduce them all at the same time, and then we'll get into the discussion. Please, as you're listening to Fiona and listening to the introduction from the panelists, and as we go into the discussion, please put your questions into the Q&A, and you'll see a button at the bottom of your screen for you to be able to do that, to make sure that I can see them and ask those questions of our discussants later in the session. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Fiona Cousins. Fiona is a mechanical engineer by training. She's Arup's Americas Region Chair and a member of Arup's Global Board. She's previously served as the Deputy Chair of the Digital Executive and the Automation Leader for the firm. Fiona also practices as a sustainability consultant and brings over 30 years of experience across technical and policy-related industries that all work towards a sustainable, equitable future. Fiona is an expert in the intersection of climate, sustainable development, equity, and digital technologies. Fiona, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Eileen. And thank you also to the National Building Museum for the honour that you've given us as the recipient of your 35th award. So I'm just going to share a few words about why what we're trying to do as a firm in this space, and to just try and frame this idea of these intersecting crises. So we've been aware for a long time, and as an engineer, I love to say it, that built infrastructure forms the foundation of our society. It enables all of our activities and our institutions. Without utility connections or transport infrastructure or buildings, we couldn't do much of what we like to do. We would be far closer to the survival and subsistence levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But our leadership challenge as engineers, architects, designers, and as citizens is becoming ever more complex. We are more aware than ever of the impacts of the built environment on people as individuals, on society as a whole, and on the natural environment. And the planet is overrun with humans, so our impact is significant at global scale. And our mental models around this work are such that the calculations around the construction of any of the built infrastructure that we engage with are driven by economics, and that the benefits of the things that we do don't always come back to the people who are doing the building. This can be as simple as separating capital and operating expenses, or as tricky as evaluating the cost and benefit of ecosystem services. In other words, it's not easy being green. We need to understand the constraints around a project, be they social, economic, climate-related, or environmental, in order to be able to understand the impact of that project and the ways in which we can make it better. I have personally been working, as Rob says, in the green building space for around 30 years, starting very narrowly focused on energy efficiency work and shifting over time towards carbon emissions and advocacy for sustainable outcomes on my projects. The world has changed a lot in that time. I used to struggle to write payback calculations for more efficient boilers, and now there are gas bans forbidding burning of fossil fuel for heating in many cities in the USA. Climate change used to be very much a niche interest with real doubt in the science, but now it's a mainstream issue with very little doubt. There's a countdown clock for this, for climate action in Union Square in New York City. That's how mainstream it's become. And cities and countries are racing towards net zero emissions, with all of the language around it being a crisis. This is real change. Of course, as we have begun to address climate change, we have also become more and more aware of our other impacts and the other services that the natural environment provides to us. What do I mean by that? Natural landscapes provide what are sometimes called ecosystem services: food chains, fresh air, clean water, flood resistance, drainage pathways, and the spaces for rest and recovery that are essential to our civilization and to the function of our built environment. But as with energy efficiency in the 90s, we don't have agreed language or goals around biodiversity and environmental impact that resonate broadly enough through society. Janine Benyus, perhaps the progenitor of ideas of biomimicry in the built environment, talks powerfully about developments that are as generous as the landscapes that they replace in terms of what they provide to us. The International Living Future Institute has an award system that rewards zero net energy, zero net water, but zero is a really difficult goal. And what do you mean? What happens after zero? Others, including Arup, talk very cautiously, because it will be a very long journey, about the need to become regenerative in the way in which we build. And all three of these are attempts to find ways to articulate and then to address the biodiversity crisis that we find ourselves in. How we view our civilization or society is also changing. In the US, we now have a very sharp focus on social equity issues. The murder of George Floyd and many others, and the Black Lives Matter movement are part of that thread. And the inequitable way in which COVID-19 has affected poor people and people of color make it clear that society is unequal in ways that are deeply unjust. And this matters as we consider the changes that we have to make to achieve net zero carbon emissions by 2050 or 2035. The infrastructure that needs to be constructed to refuel our power grid and provide storage must go somewhere and be built by someone, and it will be expected to provide an investment return to those who construct it. Where should it go? Who should build it? And who should benefit financially? As I reflect on my years and years of energy efficiency work, I realize that we never looked broadly enough at the issues. Saving energy and getting a payback for the operator is a tiny part of the story. But reducing climate change impacts, which is what we're really trying to do through energy use reductions, can and should improve air quality and safety for everyone. We might have been more impactful if we had understood this and articulated our goals more broadly earlier. The truth is that the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the social injustice crisis that we are facing are all inextricably entwined, both in their roots and in their solutions. At the same time that we're navigating these crises, as Rob said, I've had a lot of involvement in digital over the years, the world seems to be changing faster in almost every other respect as well. Digital technologies and innovations are changing both our built environment and the way in which we interact as individuals, socially and professionally, and as companies, as our ability to tap into data insights and technology shapes the services we offer and the way that we compete and collaborate. This has created new sources of inequality through the digital divide and algorithmic bias, as well as enormous opportunities to measure, manage, and control our human impact on both the environment and each other. I'm far from being a Luddite here. I've worked hard to become as much of a digital native as is possible for anyone in their 50s to be. And while we must be careful about how we do use digital, being alert to unjust or unintended consequences, there is enormous potential to use data and digital practices to understand and manage our impacts. This potential, exists all across the built environment, from flood management through better understanding of ground conditions, to improved safety in inspections by minimizing working at height, to energy saving, to materials passports to enable the circular economy, to embodied carbon calculations, to access and services and informations for all parts of the population, and close to this particular engineer's heart, to improve design and analysis processes that allow the exploration of more and better options. This has been driven by many different developments, including the vast increase in available data due to the lower cost of sensors, ubiquitous wireless, and other Internet of Things innovations, and then also the collection and collation and analysis of this data in very structured ways. In this arena of enormously rapid change, how can we synthesize all this work, all this material, and work out how to make it useful so we can get from ideas to action? I think that we really have to lean into the challenges that exist and have the courage to begin to make change. Thank you, Robert. It's back to you.
Thanks, Fiona. Thanks for setting up and introducing the session to us. Really appreciate it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to bring in the three additional panelists. I'm going to spend a minute to introduce them to you. It's literally a minute. I could talk about half an hour about each one of these panelists, I have to say, the depth and breadth of their experience. So I just want to make a few high-level comments about each one of them. First, welcome Deanna Van Buren. And Deanna Van Buren is an award-winning architect and co-founder of Designing Justice plus Designing Spaces, an architecture and design firm with the mission of building infrastructure to end mass incarceration, such as the revolutionary Near West Side Peacemaking Center in Syracuse, New York, and Restore Oakland and Pop-Up Resource Village. As a pioneering activist, Deanna is recognized as one of only 500 licensed Black women architects in the United States, been featured on TED Women, and honored by the American Institute of Architects San Francisco, as well as Architectural Records Women in Architecture Awards honoring pioneering professionals. Welcome, Deanna. Tom Gray joins us from the UK. He is an ecological designer with experience in the development and implementation of ecological strategies and plans that deliver nature positive results for the benefits of society. Tom works with us at Arup and is a chartered environmentalist and full member of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management. A major focus of his work is helping clients understand the societal benefits of nature and come up with ways to integrate natural systems on projects that are equitably accessible and which foster care for nature. And lastly, welcome Professor Uwe Brandes, who is Professor of Practice and Faculty Director of the Urban and Resilience Program and faculty member of Georgetown Global Cities Initiative. He serves as chair of the District of Columbia's Commission on Climate Change and Resilience. Uwe is a scholar practitioner in the field of urban design and sustainable urban development. He has more than 25 years of experience in planning, design, and community development partnership. Significant for this conversation is that Uwe was Senior Vice President for Global Initiatives at the Urban Land Institute, where he created and directed ULI's climate change program and served in the District of Columbia's government as Managing Director of the Anacostia Waterfront Initiative. So please welcome Deanna, Tom, Uwe, and Fiona back to the stage. Okay, team. I'm going to open up with a broad question. It's a question of framing, and the question to you all is: look, how should we frame our thinking to address these intersecting crises? Because this can all seem so daunting, right? How do you approach the issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's about process, right? Starting to create creative processes by which we bring a lot of stakeholders to the table, working radically across discipline to do that, but also with community members who don't have all the technical expertise that we bring, knowing that they are experts in their own communities. And that creative process sort of opens their minds to new ideas, new ways of thinking. And that's really the only way I know to do it. I get people at the table in creative ways to start to think through all these things intersectionally. Like I can't do Post-its and just talk to you in PowerPoint, where we got to get in there and have conversation in a creative way.
I would agree wholeheartedly with what Diana says. One of the most stifling problems that we face as a design unit when it comes to innovation, and that's where my focus comes from, designing stuff that restores, regenerates biodiversity, for instance. The worst thing that we can do is leave people out of that discussion early on. It's people want to be part of it. People inherently know what we should be doing as designers. And for me, it's integrating. It's getting those people who are focused on the social aspects, the environmental aspects, and as well as the engineering and architectural aspects around the table to set the brief of a project. It's all too often that some of these things are left a little bit too late. So you end up playing catch up, and the results are never as impactful as they could be if you get people around the table early and engaging, as Deanna says, in a creative process. I think that's probably one of the most powerful things that you can do to approach it.
I think it's as Tom says. I mean, the way that I would frame it is sort of from a design point of view. It's like, have you unearthed and found all of the impacts and all of the constraints? Because if you haven't unearthed and found all of those impacts and constraints, you haven't actually set up your design problem properly. And although that's a very sort of designery way of thinking about it, this question of what is the problem we're trying to solve has to be the very first question that we put in front of ourselves. And I think that whether that's through additional voices or just opening a really broad lens on the kind of impacts that you're having, those are the things that kind of need to happen to get started.
Robert, let me jump in. First of all, it's wonderful to be here with everyone, and I wanted to congratulate Arup on this very distinguished award from the National Building Museum. I wholeheartedly agree with everyone's comments. It's really about engagement, but together with engagement, it's I think, as Fiona is saying, it's a recognition that we must be in a transition, in a process of change, and working towards performative outcomes. And I think that's one of the big kind of framing aspects of climate change, especially on the mitigation side of things, that, you know, these are systems that can be measured, and we all need to understand that we are part of those systems and that we have a responsibility to change those systems.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that commonality of starting early, starting wide, starting deep into the conversations. A really sort of follow-up question there around thinking about how interconnected these crises are. I'm just keen on picking at that. I mean, why is that so important in this framing, the early framing and discussion of issues in this context? Perhaps Deanna, back to you.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we're working in predominantly very low income Black and Brown communities that have been impacted by mass incarceration across the United States. All of them are living in environmental conditions that are harming them deeply. And so we're starting to see, you know, increased amounts of lead poisoning, and people don't have access to trees and green space at all. You know, these sort of everyone talks about food deserts, we have tree deserts. So the impact it's having on their health is tremendous. Issues of preterm birth, I mean, it's massive on top of the social issues we're dealing with, right? So we can look at the environment, but folks don't have access to public transport, they don't have jobs, they're struggling to get access to fresh food, healthy food. So the intersectionality of these things is impacting the communities we're in every single day. So we're tasked with, you know, when we do this community engagement, we're not just looking at the environment, we're looking at the financial, you know, the sort of economic justice issues that are at play, the social justice issues that are at play. Because if we don't look at them all at the same time, we only tackle one piece of that, we're not doing very much. We can make beautiful, sustainable, regenerative buildings all day long. People still don't have jobs, they still don't have housing, they still don't have those things. So a lot of the way that we're working is trying to bring folks in from various sectors at the same time to think through all these issues all at once. Not easy, but doable.
We've experienced this even in some of the work we do on a smaller scale in cities, that we've done school outreach, for instance, and tried to just engage them on the topic of nature. And these are people who have lived in very, very central housing estates on London. And I've shown them a picture of a frog, for instance. I know this sounds quite trite, but somebody said, "What is that?" And having grown up in the countryside, and it was just something I knew, and I never knew where I learned it, because I had this appreciation of nature, having grown up in the next to a woodland my whole life. And a common problem that we see is that people who aren't exposed to nature when they're young don't value it as much when they're older. But we also know that access to green space is so important for people's health. There's some evidence that shows that that access to green space is linked to lower crime communities as well. And so there's a really important social intersection there. And the other one where biodiversity and climate change really butt heads is we're already experiencing, I think it's a 1.1 so far degree rise since 1900 conditions. Now that is causing sea level to rise, which is causing loss of biodiversity, which is exacerbating the climate crisis, which itself is going to be leading to more loss of biodiversity. So we're getting ourselves into a negative feedback loop there. So these are, just to answer your question, Robert, those are the ones that really stand out to me as the most interconnected through the work that we do, and the latter potentially the more dangerous feedback loop that we, as people working in the design community, must try to avoid.
I think that this intersection comes sort of at both ends. It happens, as Tom just said, in the results. You know, as you constrain biodiversity, you make the climate crisis worse, and it kind of feeds into this negative loop. But there's also a piece where, you know, a lot of that early work that I did in energy efficiency, we talked very clearly about it's about energy efficiency. It's about trying to get a payback on the chiller or the boiler or whatever. What we should have been talking about is those are not the only consequences of the decision. There are many, many more stakeholders in this. And actually getting rid of fossil fuel burning in cities is really good from the point of view of health and well-being. It helps flatten the landscape a little bit around some of the environmental justice issues, because you don't have to put the power stations in the, you don't have so many power stations to locate in so many different places. So you're much less likely to be uneven and unequal about the things that you're trying to do. So I think it's this idea about how do you open the lens wide enough that you actually see the full consequences of what you're doing, rather than taking this really narrow mental model of, does it pay back or not? And the answer is it never pays back if you don't broaden the lens widely enough to say, well, actually, it's about people's health, at which point the payback, the economic reckoning, the way in which you judge the outcomes of the solution are so different.
Yeah, I want to build on this and connect back to what Fiona was talking about before about the infrastructure systems that really sustain us as people. And one of the things that I really see emerging within the climate dialogue is really a centering of the issues of community, as Deanna's discussing them, and also really centering a sense of humanism in the broader climate conversation as not just a kind of a co-benefit or some kind of like, you know, external aspect of climate strategies, but as central to the way in which we think of our response to climate change. These are the systems that sustain us as individuals and communities. And if we don't recenter that conversation back to the manner in which we sustain ourselves, I just don't see how we're ever going to accomplish this broader change that is necessary.
Yeah, I think one of the projects that we did, it was several years ago now, is a city that we were working for said, we're not really interested in a climate action plan. We're interested in a social action plan. So everything that we want to do for climate, you have to do it through the lens of social equity and justice for our community. And we were a little bit surprised at the beginning of that project. We hadn't taken that viewpoint before, but actually standing in that place and saying, okay, what does this do from the point of view of the people who are here and the community and the safety and the justice in that community, actually got us far, far further and got us much better and different results about what we prioritized in terms of climate change reduction and how we did it. And I think just turning the lens and looking a different way really, really changed the quality of the conversation that we had, and absolutely improved the outcomes in ways that we had definitely not expected to begin with. And this was one of the most sort of powerful professional experiences for me ever. It's just like, oh, don't look at it from this narrow engineering view, look at it from the point of view of the people and the community, and you should get much further.
Yeah, that's well said. And I was just thinking, I mean, perhaps Uwe, I'm going to actually put you on the spot here and just follow up on this on this question, because it's really around what the past, whether the past actually is a guide to the future, in particular around precedents, planning precedents, and just thinking about actually how we scale up our practice and innovation to meet challenge. It's one of these, you know, this is easier said than done. So, I mean, Uwe, what are your thoughts?
Thank you for that. I have two important points related to that I think I want to make just to build on our conversation here. One is one of the things that, you know, many of us are involved in now is this conversation around resilience and really kind of trying to assess risk profiles. And I think that has, you know, certainly in light of what we've been going through in the last couple of years of the global pandemic, shed just an extraordinarily clear picture that risks and opportunities are not evenly distributed across our communities. And so the kind of growing kind of awakening, if you will, of the disparity of risk and value across the built environment and across the social landscape is something that is incredibly important to factor into our thinking. And that is not something that we've been good at in the past. In fact, many of our systems have been designed to intentionally exclude people in our communities. And we have long, practices associated with that, especially in the area of urban planning. The flip side of that, and maybe the second point I want to throw out for additional discussion, is that the change and the time frame that we have available to make the changes that we know are scientifically posited to us are so rapid that we cannot just rely on a kind of an evolutionary process of innovation where we just rely on the best practice of yesterday and continue to kind of advance that as a benchmark of progress. We really need science-based targets to inform the manner in which we conceptualize solutions. And that is something that I think requires us all to kind of embrace this idea of unprecedented action. It sounds kind of scary to say unprecedented action, but if we are informed by science, we really need to kind of think about designing new solutions that we may not have employed in the past.
I would agree with Uwe there. We've done a little bit of research, and I think one of our senior leaders in the organization is a member of one of the steering committees for the science-based targets. And quite recently, the last couple of years, they've been developing the science-based targets for business for nature, which isn't the neatest acronym, but it's a brilliant piece of work, and it brings together huge amounts of scientific research into what underpins what underpins the resilience of nature, and what can we do to prevent its loss. Because it's very easy for some companies to understand where they are dependent on nature and where they are dependent on functional ecosystems. To put it really simply, if you produce paper, you need wood. But if you're not replenishing your woodlands from where you're taking your trees, you are at risk, and your business is unsustainable. So put in its most simple terms, what we're trying to, what the industry needs is robust targets that help companies understand exactly what their risks, their dependencies on nature are, and their risks to that ongoing output from nature. And I think that is going to be transformative for the design industry, because precedent can sometimes be the death of innovation, but not everybody can afford to innovate. It's not every business that has several million hectares just to have a go on. We know that we need a huge amount of innovation to be able to make this work. But if people are going to be investing in this, they need to know it's actually going to work. And so, yes, I've experienced a lot of times where in the first of our double diamonds in our design meetings, we're reaching as far wide as we can, but then the cost consultants will bring us back down to earth and say, well, no one can afford this. So it's a very interesting balance right now, and I'd say we have to tackle it from both ends of that.
Yeah, I'm not a scientist, and I'm a social justice kind of gal. So I'm just sort of trying to frame it within the context of the communities that we're working with and this sort of innovation that happens every day, right? You don't have to have a lot of money to innovate, I think, at some level, right? The innovation can happen at many, many micro scales and needs to happen across many different sectors. So it's not, I've seen communities who've started their own stormwater management programs, right? They're starting to build on that. They're also, I keep going back to economics, but we have the person who's on the street selling their cookies that they made in their home and that they're growing in their backyard. So, I'm very interested in those small scale innovations that I see people doing as that starts, and I see it spreading, right? Actually, in the wake of COVID, that we're seeing more and more people buying land, setting up land trusts, starting to do more urban agriculture and farming. So that fascinates me, that the way that innovation happens without us and then sometimes with us. And that is also an important scale to look at, because I think the change happens at a micro, hyper local scale. And you have to have 1 million of those all at once. So how do we catalyze and ignite that kind of thinking and movement-based work?
I think there's something really interesting in all that about sort of innovation without cash. So there's quite a lot of work in this creativity literature about the more constraints you have, the more you have to sort of allow necessity to be the mother of invention. And so actually innovation happens sometimes more regularly, or more, the problems are more acute when there isn't money to kind of pay for them. And actually the little incremental things turn out to be quite big incremental things, because they change the way that people think about whether they have agency or not, for example, or whether they can actually really make this change, or how responsible they can be within their community, or whether they can actually make change, or whether it's something that whether the community that they live in, the built environment they live in, is something that happens to them rather than something that they have influence over. So I think that some of the small bits of innovation without cash actually change mindset. And it's a change mindset that leads to some really big reactions, and then separately, but also in this idea about it doesn't have to cost more money. It may actually cost less if you can think about the problem in a broad enough way and think about the solution that you're trying to get to and what it is, or the problem that you're trying to solve in a sort of more constrained and helpful way.
Yeah, thanks, Fiona. I'm actually gonna go back to you, Deanna. This sense of creating space for innovation, setting the table for change, or again, how do you put these ideas actually into tangible action to actually either create the space for the 1,000 innovations that you talked about, or actually deliberatively foster innovations? Can you talk about that for a little bit, and then I'm interested in the views of the other panelists too.
Sure. Yeah, we've been trying a whole variety of strategies and tools and toolkits and different design strategies based on the project. I think to be honest, you have to create a safe emotional space for people to come into, right? So that they feel like they can access their creativity. So that is you can do that through sitting in circle. We really actually start most of our engagements that way, where people are sharing something about themselves. And then we will move into everything from role play to full-scale mock-ups. We bring play and joy into it, right? We gamify stuff. We have a space planning and finance game, right? And people are throwing gambling chips. Like you have to kind of create an environment that moves people into elastic thinking, right? The brain will go into that modality if you provide those kinds of environments, emotional safety and creative play. And out of that, we've been able to, when people get into that, the ideas they come up with are amazing. And I've done that inside of a prison, in a jail. I've done it in a mayor's office. Like, it doesn't matter. I've seen it over and over again. It works every single time. I have one guy I couldn't break down, just one guy out of all this time. And, it's incredible to experience. Also, you'll find that if you move people into that space, they will also process feelings and emotions. So I think there's a healing component to this. I love the work of Joanna Macy. We can't even cope with what's happening in the environment psychologically. So, I've seen people move into tears, into grief, into joy, into celebration. This sort of emotional experience of innovating and ideating and coming up with these strategies is really powerful, really powerful.
Robert, I'd like to build on that a little bit, Robert, and just talk about the intersection of what we're increasingly describing as biophilia, as our relationship, our kind of physical relationship to nature on the one hand, and then this broader expression of climate change on the other. And one of the things that I just find fascinating about the dialogues and the work that we're all engaged in is that change happens in a unique way, in a place-based manner. And so this idea of innovation we cannot imagine a successful transition to a kind of a sustainable future by partitioning innovation in some way. It has to be across the board, as Deanna is describing it. And one of the things that is really driving that, which is really fascinating, is the need for local communities to come to terms with the manner in which climate change is expressing itself in the place where they live.
Oh, that was really well said. Thank you, Uwe. Thank you, Deanna. And Fiona, Tom, any points you'd just like to pick on before I drill you with my next question that I'm keen to get onto?
I was just sorry, Fiona.
I think Deanna raises really important points about creating a place of emotional safety where these ideas for innovation can actually happen. I think, and Uwe talked about this a little bit, this idea of sort of precedent and how you work through the things that we know work in order to solve things that we've never had to solve in quite the sort of intensity before. These are really, really difficult problems, and we don't have much to rely on. We have precedent, we have our thinking, but actually we have to create the spaces where people can innovate and make time and place in order to sort of use the things that we know from the precedents to solve in new ways, to sort of rely on that basis of knowledge to do something quite different.
I just echo what Fiona said. When Deanna was talking, I wrote down create safe emotional space. I've never really considered the requirements of innovation within that framework, and actually, I'm very new to the idea of gamification, and I'd love to explore that more, because I've done it in a very robotic way. We've created some cards, and we've given the cards out to. So, for instance, local government leadership, and they've chosen their favourite nature-based solution to solve a particular part of their city's whichever crisis they happen to be facing. And it's a really interesting way of opening things up. But I would agree, I've never seen more passion or innovation come through in those spaces. But I would also agree with Uwe that it has to be. It can come from the grassroots, but it also has to come from, I think, sometimes the government either setting the example or providing the support network through either regulatory frameworks or funding, just to ease the transition into this idea of big scale innovations.
Yeah, well, look, Tom, that you've absolutely hit the nail on the head, because that's actually where I was going to go to. I mean, back to Deanna's point about this, creating the space for change, creating the space of innovations to bloom, if you like. I mean, what is that role, panelists? What you've seen the table setting or creating the space from government policy from all levels, from federal, state, city, all the way through to community scales. Those scales of supporting innovation, or is there something to reconcile there? So I'm keen to hear your thoughts.
One of the things that your question prompts in my mind, Robert, is this relatively simple term that of systems, that of course is incredibly complex when really kind of investigating and trying to devise strategy. And I think the systems of systems ideas that are, so commonly discussed in kind of resilience frameworks really are not limited to resilience, right? I mean, systems of systems is the kind of foundation, kind of going back to Fiona's comment about infrastructure sustaining us. It is not just one system, it's many systems that are sustaining us. And I think where we've got more work to do is to bridge some of those concepts to the very important points that I think Deanna is making about systems not only being large-scale systems, but actually some systems being systems of many small-scale systems, and the kind of agency, if you will, associated with describing and potentially altering those systems is also totally distributed. For me, as I've been thinking about this, and I'm sure the folks at Arup are thinking about this all the time, this raises many, many issues associated with professional practice of, what is the frame that you're seeking to engage, and how does that relate to the need for this very distributed both innovation and transformation?
I think that one of the things you're pointing out over is this huge kind of piece. These three intersecting crises are enormous, and the systems of systems view is kind of mind-boggling, right? Everybody get their head around the complexity that needs to be got around in order to kind of understand the whole problem. And at the same time, we don't need to solve the whole problem in order to make steps that are going in the right direction. So I would say that it's not a conflict really, it's a tension between, oh my goodness, the problem is so big and there's so much intersectionality here. And actually, we know how to give people agency, we know how to make things better, and we know some of the steps in order to kind of get us along the way. And as I listen to you and listen to Deanna, it's like we're sort of coming at it, not from opposite ends, and as I said, not with conflict, but I think that the idea about knowing what to do next, retaining optimism in the face of all this is quite tricky. Deanna, I'm going to open it up to you. It looks like Robert has suffered an internet failure. So Deanna, if you'd like to
okay. I'm also having like psychedelic world over here. So I hope everyone's enjoying my green eyes and green teeth. I'm doing my best. But, Tom was saying something that, resonated. Yes, it's sort of very grassroots efforts, but it does require top roots too, right? This sort of coming together. The times we've seen the greatest success on our projects, and I always think of them as prototypes. So we're prototyping new things, and that in the prototyping of it, real innovation has been able to happen when we've had grassroots support, often grassroots leading, right? They're the ones pushing. And then in alignment with municipalities, we can see this happening in LA County with the LA County Board of Supervisors, Justice LA Coalition of Community Organizers, stopping the building of prisons, creating a distributed network of care over incarceration. That's a huge county, that's a huge initiative that folks are starting to look at. And that happened because there was alignment across those things. And it took some time, some real pushing from community organizers, but it happened, and I'm seeing that happen around the country. So when we come in, we try to come in, you want to come in when the soil's fertile, right? There's some real juice in it already, and be able to come in and elevate it and build the prototypes that can start to have impact. Like, what do you mean you can't do it? We did it. You can do it, right? Mayors love, I'm just talking about mayors because mayors are on my mind. They don't like to do something unless somebody else has done it. Did you do it? Oh, okay. So we're just trying to get the prototype built and then replicate it. And getting prototypes built and replicated requires some political alignment across a lot of groups. So that's our theory of change. I think it's working.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that idea that you need to prepare the ground in order to be able to give people permission in some ways to innovate. There is a top-down context that it's possible to create, and that it is important to create in order to allow other things to emerge. I think it's a really helpful thing to point out. Tom or Uwe, did you want to come in on this idea about how do we create this space, time, join?
I was just going to make a quick comment, Tom, and then over to you. But we of course have many conversations in society right now around scaling. Fiona, you talked about the digitization and the manner in which systems themselves are kind of changing. But I think that I think this idea of prototyping and replicability is incredibly important, because this transformation is so large in the sense that it will not be designed in a sense. And so finding the ways in which communities can sustain themselves is an incredibly important aspect to this, because the kind of boundaries of professional practice are not going to, I think, get us all the way to where we need to go.
Right. So I think Robert is nearly back, but I'm going to ask the next question because I have it. So what are your experiences with the economic drivers behind the causes and potential solutions of these crises? Are there new or emerging financial models that we should be taking advantage of?
It's quite a simple answer from a biodiversity perspective, although it is immensely complex. But we've understood for quite some time that biodiversity gives us pretty much everything. I think there was a recent task force that said something like half of the world's financial, half the world's products and things that are produced are highly or moderately dependent on functional, resilient ecosystems. And I would, anybody who's interested in this particular space, I would say go and look at something called the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. They're trying to help businesses and governments and entire systems understand what value nature provides, the ecosystem services, the things nature functional systems give to us, and they're trying to describe the value of that to an individual business, to an individual municipality, for instance. It's a really fascinating look into what nature gives to us. And this is a really interesting one about kind of the tail wagging the dog. And kind of going back to Deanna's point about prototyping, what we tend to find in design is that it's kind of a middle ground, that innovation comes and then government policy follows. And the same sort of thing is happening with these financial models as well. There are systems, there are bodies out there that are looking at that are working super hard to articulate the benefits of nature, the benefits of investing in nature as well, and government policy is following. So I would say that that's at least one way that institutions are looking at solving this crisis, helping businesses understand what we are losing as a result of depleting nature.
Thanks, Tom.
I think this is just such a difficult question, Fiona. And I think in sustainability, as we think about sustainable environments and sustainable built environments, there's just this paradox, because ultimately we need to consume less and not consume more. And so we have to value that in a way. I see in so many conversations I'm involved in that there's a difficulty in trying to find a way to value the sustainable option. And I think this question, which alone is very challenging, relates directly to where we started off with social equity and environmental justice, and finding ways for communities to benefit for things that they don't consume.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think I'm having asked the question, but it wasn't my question. I think it's enormously difficult to figure out how you make the financial model work. I mean, the sort of my example right from the beginning about I'm trying to make a payback calculation on a boiler. It's just the wrong question to be asking, but it's the one that's driven by the pure economics. So how do you then take that next step? I don't know, Deanna, in your world, if there's a way of kind of accounting or trying to make a financial benefit from somehow recognizing the value of the things that you do that maybe don't have monetary value.
No, I love to talk about money and finance and strategies. And I think because like with our projects, so we get time down to the sustainability measures and we can't afford the paint. So, what we need is folks who are doing that modeling to put into the pro forma. We're architects and real estate developers. So we very much believe that communities to own their assets, own the real estate, so they don't get displaced, so they can really invest. And we're really trying hard now to think through with folks, how can we build the payback into the pro forma, right? So up front, we know we have sources and uses, how we're going to develop this building. But I've got to be working with folks really, because I'm not an expert, so I need help from y'all's to figure out how we're going to pay for the systems the community needs and wants and should have, and desperately, because if you're low income, you need to have long-term operating expenses to be low. Can't afford the energy bill, right? You've got messed up pipes, so your water's bad. Like there couldn't be a more critical communities to have this stuff. So what are the tricks and ways that we can start to do that? on the real estate side, not just thinking about the money, right? Looking at social impact bonds, starting to look at cooperative ownership models. So we're thinking on the real estate side a lot, and how do we begin to integrate the financing for these other aspects, the environmental sustainability aspects, so that we can make sure it happens.
That's well said. Yeah, that's really well said. And I was just listening to the feedback there, and one of the words that resonated with me is finding value. Actually finding what value is and what the values are, and putting the economic value within that context. It's one type of value, of course. Look, I'm going to pivot. I was just looking at the clock here, team. We haven't got too long left together, and I was just going to pivot to an operational question. You've all really challenged the respective professions that you're working in to really step up, innovate, evolve, and Deanna, I think you used the word radical imagination, thinking, elastic thinking, and so on. I mean, how do you see the evolution of the professions that you are members of, to be able to engage and to bring the professions along with you in order to scale up the challenges that are needed? What are you all thinking?
Yeah, I think that we have to change a lot. I spoke to Berkeley last week, the graduating class at Berkeley, and I was like, we have to shake this industry up. And I think the firm that we have, where we're starting to see like a multidisciplinary firm, there were also just a lot of new things we need to learn. I had to learn a ton of new things to even be able to practice this way. I didn't learn how to do engaged communities and radical imagination at school. I didn't learn about finance and real estate in school. I didn't learn about any of that stuff. So there's a lot of new skills, techniques that we need to do. We need to get out from behind the monitors, the computers, and go actually talk to people and listen and hear. We need to move way upstream. That's another thing. We need to be up at the table where policy is being made and thinking through, which a lot of my colleagues here are doing. And those are just new ways of practicing and thinking about architecture, right? That we're not at the end of the road after the RFP goes out, or working for the institutional and the wealthy all the time and responding, but that we're actually leading, and that requires a new set of skills and strategies. And it's messy and emergent, and you're being flexible, but I don't know how else we're going to make it happen if we don't start to work a little differently.
I'll just build on that. I totally agree. I think even at the professional level, we have a collective action problem. And one of the things that I think is really going to help break the ice is not just radical imagination, but radical transparency. So we have to embrace performance management. We have to understand how systems perform over time and pull back, various aspects of the decision making to the various actors involved in the outset.
I think there are two things here. Deanna and Uwe have both highlighted something that I've sometimes used, which is that the owners of buildings and development tend to say, well, I would have done more if the professionals, the architects and engineers, had said that I should do more. And the architects and engineers tend to say, well, it would have been much easier to have that conversation with you if the law had been much, the hurdle of the law were higher, because then I wouldn't have to have that conversation. I'd just be able to do the right thing. And what the lawmakers tend to say is, we govern by consent of the governed. And so we need you as the owners to vote for better regulations. And it's a very vicious spiral, because everybody's pointing the finger in some other direction than at themselves. And I think what you say about this kind of convening power, the sort of power of collective action within the professions and then across the professions, so that you bring in policy and owners, users, community, and actually say, no, we all want to take this big step forward, and there are good reasons for all of us to do it, is actually where you begin to kind of break this tricky spiral. I think that the other kind of big thing here is around communications chains. I think we tend to speak different languages. And there's been a lot of work done around how we communicate around climate change. And certainly in my early days of working on it, was like, well, I want you to use less, and I want you to wear a hair shirt and beat yourself every morning as well, because that's the only way forward. And that's not useful language for getting people inspired and enthused about making changes in their lives. And I think that this idea about how do we communicate about the things that we need so that we are speaking a language that allows people to gather behind us is something that, to Deanna's point, you didn't learn it in school, right? How do you talk to people is not something that is part of an architecture or engineering education. The focus is on, does the beam bend the way you expect it to bend, or the air move the way you expect it to move? It's a very different set of skills that you don't become professionally equipped with in the first instance.
That was wonderful. I was just taking some notes. The power of collective action, the power of thought, actually, that just actually inspiring me. Sorry, I just wanted to write some of those things down. All right, look, I'm going to do a round the houses lightning round for some final thoughts, but I'm actually going to challenge you to really talk to us about, should we be depressed about the scale of the challenge and the barriers that we've just discussed, or on the flip side, should we be hopeful and actually energized by the opportunities for scaling radical change? How would you leave the participants to think about these issues?
Robert, I can kick off if you like, because I would say both. I think we shouldn't kid ourselves that the world is in a brilliant condition. We should probably have a little bit of dread about it, but only a little bit, because we see that some ecosystems are failing. We are pushing certain species to the brink of extinction, and we are losing habitats which are critical to our survival. But one of the things that makes me really energized and enthused about the whole process is that things are changing, and the people who we're bringing on as graduates right now wouldn't accept the kind of practice that I was did accept 15 years ago. People coming through have been raised on understanding that climate change is real, it's happening, and it's dangerous. People have been raised to appreciate the morality of protecting species. And I would say a lot of the junior members of our team are pushing us as senior designers to make better decisions. So I would say that the new generation coming through are a brilliant reason to be enthused by it. And if I could change one thing, it would be linking it to political short-termism. I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have with the big changes that we know are needed.
I think we need to be realistic. And what I mean by that is that we need to learn and understand the science of climate change, not just how it affects the world, but how it affects our community and our place where we live. And then we have to lean into our ideals and embrace that sense of optimism that we have to change and innovate and adapt. I agree with Tom. We have the ability to do that, but we need to really understand our own problems.
I agree with Uwe and Tom. I think there's a lot of healing that needs to happen. That's a big theme of the way that I approach a lot of this work, but I'm a hyper optimist. And I know for a fact we can do it, right? We actually have the capacity to do it. And I think there's a lot of waking up that's happening right now. I think when you see a lot of conflict, that's actually a sign that awakening is happening. And also, same with Tom, like the next generation coming along knows the thing. They're passionate, they're excited, they're fired up. There's room for just being cautious and watching. I'm very nervous about the folks who refuse to believe in climate change, who refuse to believe that racism exists, who refuse to believe that's even happening. Those to me are the most disturbing people. But there are probably more people who actually do know that we need to make some serious change. And my question back at you and others is like, what are you going to do? Right? What action are you going to take? Because it will take every single one of us, no matter what you do, right? It doesn't matter whether you drive a bus, whether you're a nurse, whether you're a mechanic, doesn't matter. There's a role to play within this context, and the inquiry on what your action is an important one. And I see people doing that.
Yeah, that's absolutely wonderful. Fiona, any closing remarks?
Well, I mean, I think it's very easy to be depressed. And to Tom's point, I mean, we need to be a little bit of both. But I think that for the good of our society existing on the planet and for our roles in leadership, if you're not optimistic, you sort of have nothing, you have nowhere to go. If you don't believe that you have the agency to change, if you don't believe that the things that you're going to do make a difference, it can be really, really difficult to, get out of bed in the morning, far less actually act and work and move in the world. So I think that we shouldn't be depressed, because I think that actually that won't make anything better. But I think if we can be hopeful and optimistic and lean into the problem, then actually there are many, many opportunities for leading, as we've said, at many different scales. The complexity of the problem and the micro innovations are all really important in this journey.
Wonderfully said. I'm just going to make my own reflection. If you just give me a minute, just to think back of some of the key things that I've heard from you all. Fiona, on your last point, that I wrote down leading by listening, listening to the voices of the community members who we are aiming to serve as professionals in this space. We all and all the participants, I'm sure, listening in, have an agency to change. And so actually using and empowering yourself with that agency. Being generous to yourself, actually, and to those that you are working with in your respective communities in the built environment, to find a space to heal and to be safe with each other. Notion of radical transparency, using elastic and creative thinking to break out from vicious circles into virtuous circles. And be open, humble, and authentic. And then finally, to Deanna's point, to really shake things up. And that's certainly what I'm aiming to do. And I'm sure all of you listening to this are thinking the same thing. So with that thoughts of shaking things up, I'm going to hand things back to the National Building Museum with my thanks and thanks from all of us in Arup.
Thank you so much. My name is Paul Kilmer. I'm the Director of Public Programs at the National Building Museum, and I've really enjoyed this conversation today. And I want to thank Robert, Fiona, Deanna, Uwe, and Tom for this conversation. I also want to thank the audience for your questions, and that you are the C in community in this ABC series. As we've just talked about, everyone here has a stake in addressing climate change. And we welcome your feedback. Did you learn something new? Do you feel more empowered to act? You'll receive a survey where you can share your valuable thoughts on this program, and I truly hope you'll take a few minutes to complete it. Please note this discussion was recorded, and an edited version will be available and free to view on our website within 10 business days. Please don't hesitate to spread the word. And if you were unable to attend previous programs in this series, please view them on our website, nbm.org. And then also for further information on the museum's 35th gala celebrating Arup, please visit the same website. That gala takes place on June 16th. Thank you all for joining us today. Bye-bye.